Right, my name is Hugh Campbell. I'm a native of Ardmore Island here. But I wasn't born here. I was born in Belfast in 1928. And I came here when I was 12 years old. And it was a new world, kind of like coming into a new world. I was glad to get away from the city slums and to get to the sand and the beaches and up to the mountain, out to the lighthouse, walking through the lakes. It was wonderful. But after a while it palled on me and I began to miss my pals from school in Belfast. The island at this time was thickly populated, around 1,400 people. And they were all engaged in seasonal work, going to Scotland and England. In the war years, that was the only work they were allowed to do. Did you know that, Seamus?
No, I didn't.
I've had to do it. Was only agricultural work. Well,
you were saying there when you arrived, we were just wanted to get a sort of an idea, your first impressions of. You came to Burtonport. How did you get to Burtonport?
My mother came to the island to look after her elderly parents. Grandmother was in the family home, and grandfather, who was much older, was in the county home, because he'd become hard to manage for the old woman, and she put him into the county home. So I came in. Mother and I travelled by train to Letterkenny, and then we got the bus from Letterkenny to Burtonport.
Right.
And some island men were out at that time. There were very few motorboats. We came in a rowing boat with a sail with Johnny Byrne, and it was a new world to me. The house was a fine old house, very old house.
That's the same house.
Two-storied house. Grandmother was a very dark woman. She looked to me like an Indian squaw. I had been used to going to the cinema, and she reminded me of Indian squaws. She had jet black hair, parted down the centre, and I was amazed to hear my mother speaking in Irish and Gaelic, because all her years in Belfast I had never heard her speaking Irish, and I was amazed to hear this fluent Irish coming from her. So as I said earlier on, life was wonderful. Playing football on the sand with the boys, going up with donkeys to take turf down from the hill, and great, until I became homesick. I went to school for 2 months, and at that time 60% of the lessons were in Gaelic. I had no Gaelic. So for 60% of the time in the school, I was at the back of the class. I was the dunce. The other 40%, the lessons were in English. And the books were so simple to me, I could laugh. Because from the age of 8, I had been in the library in Belfast. And I had read all the classics. Dickens, Dostoevsky, all these books, Dumas, Count of Monte Cristo, Rob Roy, and seeing the simple little books that they had here, I could laugh. But of course I was afraid to laugh, because Sweeney the Master would have beaten me. In fact, he did beat me, because in the Gaelic lessons he would ask me a question in Gaelic and I couldn't answer because I knew nothing about Gaelic. So he'd give me a slap and put me to the back of the class. And the boys were amused at the way I was dressed, because I was wearing a suit. I was wearing long trousers or dungarees. And most of them wore 3/4 length trousers. The people were poor at that time. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the 3/4 length trousers, they kept wearing those as they were growing, until they got quite short, and they were all patched, lots of patches.
Where would they have gotten these clothes here?
Those clothes would have been made by a local tailor.
Right. on
the island.
They bought the material and made the clothes.
Yes, they bought the material and made the clothes.
And who was the local tailor?
It was Mickey. The local tailor was Mickey. What's his name? Over in Bunninidge.
Right.
What's it? Aye, Mickey. Mickey the tailor, we called him. Right. Mickey the tailor. Your father will tell you who he is, you know.
And would he have been the only tailor on the island?
He was the only tailor on the island, and he made clothes for girls too, coats, little costumes, stuff like that, you know. He had learned his trade somewhere, and later on, as I grew out of the clothes I had from Belfast, I went over to him and got pants made. You know, the rough clothes.
Working clothes?
Rough working clothes, aye, working clothes. I got on well with the boys here. They were friendly. They're friendly. And they, for the short time I was at school, they were amazed at all I knew. And when I still meet some of them, when we still meet for a drink, they tell me about the time that they were amazed at how the arithmetic, you know.
When you arrived?
When I was in school, I used to tell them, give them the answers to the sums. Mm-hmm. They were so simple to me, you know, but they were hard to these fellas. The education, I thought the education was very poor. I thought the English was very poor, and later on, when I went to Scotland with a lot of these fellas, you know, I could see the drawbacks they had with their English.
Irish would have been their first language.
Irish was their first language. There was a girl I knew from the island, and she became a conductress on the buses, and she told me how difficult it was for her to give change. She had to make it out in her head in Irish, and then translate it into English and give the change. You know? Mm-hmm. That was difficult, you know. That was Rosie, Charlie, and War that lived over there. At that time, there was a huge crowd of people on the island, and the fields were black. Every family set a lot of potatoes, maybe half a ton of potatoes or more. The fields were black.
This was just for their own use?
For their own use. Every house had a cow, some 2 cows, a couple of donkeys, and hens, flocks of hens, mm-hmm. and geese, ducks.
What would the geese have been used for? Would they lay
the eggs? Geese were just for the eggs, and people were poor. The only time I saw apples here was around Halloween. Mm-hmm. You'd see apples in the shop. And the post came in every day with a little sailing boat. It was 3 brothers running the post. And around Christmas, there'd be 3 or 4 extra bags of mail coming as people away were sending home parcels and things like that. And this was an exciting part of the year.
So you get clothes?
Not clothes, no. There would be money, first of all, there'd be money, you know. And there'd be little gifts of some kind or other that people would send. But that Christmas week was an exciting week because we were watching the mail boat coming in and counting the bags of mail that was coming off, you know. And lots of the men would go down, and the little post office would be full of men waiting for the postmistress to hand over the gifts, the letters and gifts, you know, mm-hmm. that they bring home.
Who were the 3 brothers that ran?
The 3 brothers were 3 Boyle brothers, Mickey, Jack, and Neil, and they ran this until they were old, until they retired. They also fished in their spare time while they were younger. Mm-hmm. They fished herring, they fished salmon. And when they were fishing, one of the brothers would just take in the mail, right. Or 2 of them.
And who ran the post office at the time?
Post office was run by Charlie Dolly's mother.
Dolly?
We called her Dolly, aye. Yeah. It was a good island at the time. People were very friendly, and the fact that nobody had very much, seemed to have brought them closer together. We were all one. There was no one had much.
Mm-hmm.
We were all, and it was in the springtime. The fields there'd be people out in the fields, men and women, spreading manure, and working with spades was the only implement they had for covering the potatoes.
Would there have been any other tools used?
Spades, shovels and grapes were the only tools on the island. There was no power tools of any kind. There were no vehicles on the island at all.
And the tools themselves, they would have been made locally by a...
The tools would be bought in the cooperative. And the local shop would have bought off the cooperative. That was Barney McGill's. Where Nearly Nancy is now, Barney McGill's. Barney would have.
The cooperative itself, is this the Cope and
that was the Cope and Dunlow.
Set up by Paddy the Cope.
And they had the Cope in Burton Port too, set up by Paddy the Cope. That's where the people bought their spades and shovels.
Mm-hmm.
Shovels were used later on to mould the potatoes. The work was very hard because the fields were very stony, and it was the digging lea land was very hard work. Digging lea land was very hard work for the first crop,
Delving, is it?
Hmm?
You would have to delve.
No, it was. The manure was laid out in beds on top of the grass, just, and the shock in between was dug up and the clay spread over the beds. The beds were about 4 foot wide, and a shock on each side, and the sod lifted it and covered over the beds. This was the simplest way of breaking in the land.
Mm-hmm.
It was better than having to dig the whole land up, dig the whole field up in a piece, It was better to do this because you're only digging the tracks in between the beds, the ridges we called them. And once the potatoes were dug at the end of the season, those ridges being higher, they were dug down into the shock to level the field off again, and then it was all black, which meant people usually then sowed oats in that black pit.
Is the second crop?
No, for the following year.
Right.
No, just the first crop, one crop of potatoes and a crop of oats. That was the rotation, usually the rotation. And then there was fields of hay. People had hay growing in fields, but they usually just took a crop of hay, the hay crop off the same field year after year.
So
they just kept the field in hay.
So it wasn't good for potatoes? Would that be the
No, it was. The hay wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Both crops were necessary. The hay could be taken. You couldn't take a crop of potatoes. The hay kept growing, so you kept cutting the hay for the cattle. The potato crop, you see, just lasted until you put in the potatoes in March or April, and you dug them in October, November. So that meant that field had to be used again the following year. Some people would dig it out flat and drill it and put potatoes in it in drills the following year, But the people worked very hard. They've worked very hard because after that they had to go to the mountain to cut turf. Mm-hmm. And that was several miles they had to walk to the hill. There was no transport. They walked to the hill. 4 or 5 men would cut the turf, and the women would go up with donkeys, with the food, with the baskets, with the creels. They would go up with the food.
Where was most of the turf cut at the time? Was it?
The turf was cut just where it is being cut now, past up round the lakes, all the land round the lakes out to the lighthouse.
Mm-hmm.
That was a commonage. That's a commonage.
Park na Mina there.
Aye, it's a commonage. At one time, in long ago, when the English had it, they had a fence built across the mountain, and the people were excluded from that part of the island. There's still traces of that fence. You know, where the purification plant is up there.
For the water, yeah.
Aye, the track of the fence is still there. You know, it went across the island, and that was a good third or more of the islanders was excluded from it.
What was the idea of that?
That was just the English, the landlords had their sheep grazing there. The landlord, it was his land, he had the sheep grazing there. When my great-grandfather, when they were building the lighthouse, the present lighthouse, my great-grandfather was working there on that lighthouse. And my grandfather, as a boy of 10 or 11, he would go out with his dinner every day, walk out with the dinner, and the road, once they got past the fence onto the back of the island, the part that the landlord had. Once he got up there was the heather. The heather was like the sea, he said. It was rippling with the wind. It was beautiful, he said. It was all heather. Nowadays you can't see heather. It's all bogs. Unsightly. It's all been blackened with people cutting turf. There's just old bogs, new bogs, and it's unsightly. But at that time, he said, there wasn't a trace of a bog. When you got out to the lake, right round the lake and all the way out to the lighthouse, the heather was feet high in places, and when the wind would come, it was like the sea. Beautiful, he said. But he went out with his father's dinner every day to the lighthouse, and he had to remain on the road. He couldn't walk on the heather.
Why was that? Because
the landlord, no island people could walk on the heather. The heather, the landlord had a shepherd there. His name was Cowan. He was looking after the sheep on the mountain. And he caught my grandfather. He was a boy about 12 then, walking on the heather. He'd walked a few yards into the heather, and he came and he smacked him. Boxed his ears for leaving the road. So that of course, that all changed in 1922 when the Free State was formed, and the people began to cut turf beyond that fence, crossed over the fence. You know. My grandfather was he was born in 1847.
Sorry, Hugh, I'll just interrupt you a second. I have a wee thing of me here.
Aye.
Of your crew.
Right.
That's you there. So your grandfather was Joe?
No, Mickey.
Mickey.
Mickey there.
Oh, sorry, Mickey.
Mm-hmm.
Mickey John Day.
Aye. Aye.
He was born in, when did you say?
He was born in 1847. He was born in 1847. He was the youngest of four of a family. I don't know if you've got that right there. No, you only got them. You've got them right. And he, his parents had the foresight to send him to school when the first school was opened. The first school was opened now and more about 52, 53.
1952.
1852. Aye. 1852 or 1853, around those years. My great grandparents had the foresight to send Mickey to school. He was the only one in the family that went to school. He was the youngest, and the school was all English. He spoke Gaelic when he went to school. He was 5 years old when he went to school, and he spoke Gaelic, and he learned his English at school. And two other men of the island that I knew as old men on the island, Charlie Vigil, that's Grace Henry's grandfather, And Brian the Cooper, that's Brian Burns, Brian Brown's grandfather. Brian down there, Brian the Cooper. They went to school also. The parents sent them to school too. And all three men had copper plate writing. Beautiful writers and beautiful speakers and bookworms. My grandfather, when I knew him, he was an old man, he had 90, and he was blind, you know. But he sat here, we had a wickerwork chair, and he sat in this wickerwork chair, and I was amazed. I was amazed at all he knew is English, you know, English, and the schooling he had got, you know. We used to talk about things you wouldn't believe. He used to talk about John Sobieski, a king of Poland, that turned back the Turks at the battle of Vienna, you know, and Don John of Austria in the Mediterranean, beating the Islamic fleet down there, and things like that. He could talk on Napoleon. He could talk on his geography. He knew geography inside out, Himalayas, South America, the Andes, you know, Fiji, all the islands. And that goes down to that wonderful education that they got here in Ironmore from good teachers, you know, but only teaching English, only English.
So where was the school at the time here?
The school was away up around Shanhague somewhere. It was up that part of the place.
So they had a building there?
They had a building, aye. They had a rough sort of building, a one classroom building.
And was it for island children only, or was it for?
It was for island children and for the children of the of coast guards and lighthouse people. It was for all children on the island.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it was open to them.
Yes, my grandfather said that that the few newspapers that came to the island, they would pass from house to house, and although lots of people couldn't read, he was one of the few readers. But he remembers as a boy, 14 or 15, reading to a collection of men around him, reading about the war that had started out in the States, the American Civil War. And he can remember him a boy and these old men coming around when they knew that a newspaper had come. And grandfather was there reading to these old fellas.
So the newspapers wouldn't be that regular?
No, they weren't, no. Scraps of paper, wherever they got. It's possible that he said that he was in with the children of the Coast Guards and the lighthouse, and it's possible that that's where the papers were coming to those people, you see. Okay. And then the RIC, there was RIC men on the island as well, Royal Irish Constabulary, you know. But he would be a bright boy, you see, and people would naturally give him papers, knowing that he could read, because it was there'd only be a handful of people reading at that time, island people reading, you know.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he was the youngest of four, and he had no intention of getting married. He was just laid back. But his parents were getting old, and his mother especially was suffering from rheumatics, you know. So they said to him, they kept harping at him to take in a wife, you know. So they were anxious that he would marry a girl in the village here, a girl that lived down the road there around the post office. But grandfather had different ideas. He had seen a girl at the church. Sunday after Sunday, had seen this girl from Offord at the church. So he decided that he would go over and ask the father for her. Her name was Bridget Ward. So he had a white horse. So one day he got on the horse and he went over to Offord, about 3 miles. That's where Mary Ward lives now. You know, old Mary Ward, she's in her 90s now. Mm-hmm. Do you know the woman I'm talking about?
I think so, yeah.
Aye. So he asked he asked Frank Ward for his daughter Bridget. So Frank called Bridget up to the room, and he said to Bridget, "Do you know this man?" She said, "Yes, he's Mickey Johndy from Lugano. He's come to ask you," he said. So she says, I'd be quite happy to marry him. So they went out to Kincastle. They got married out in Kincastle. There was no, that's where the parish priest resided out there. There was no resident priest on the island at that time. They went out to Kincastle and they got married in Kincastle, and they came back to the island the same day. So the following day, Bridget was called early because it was the springtime, and the potatoes were being set, and she spent the following day creeling out dung to the ridges and spreading it with the fork, a grip. And the two men, her husband and her father-in-law, were covering the potatoes, covering the seed, and she was doing this heavy work, carrying out the manure, spreading it and setting the seed, and the two men digging the shocks and covering the ridges.
So that was the honeymoon? That
was her honeymoon. And she also had to milk 2 cows. And Sheila, her mother-in-law, was bedridden with rheumatics, and she had to come and turn her in the bed. And she was a young woman, a very young woman, and that was her honeymoon. She said she was never as tired in her life, but that was the lot for the girls anyway at that time. That was their lot. And
for the marriage, they didn't have much of a say in who they were going to marry, really?
No, the man came and he usually made an agreement with the father, you know. He usually asked the father for the girl.
And if the girl
the girls knew there was big families in the houses in those time, and a girl knew that if she turned down a man, she mightn't get another chance. And she would end up in her own home looking after her sister's children or her brother's children, just rearing them, a skivvy, you know, which happened to a lot of good women in the place. So she said she was so tired. She was so tired that she could sleep for every morning. She was dead tired, and he would put his hands in under her in the bed and stand her on her feet to get her down to the work. The work had to be done. The reason that this big rush was going on was because the turf had to be cut too. Him and grandfather had to go to the mountain and cut turf too. And then he was a fisherman. He was fishing for herring down in, let me think now where they went to fish the herring. Triana. You know where Triana is? Down the coast there.
Dunlow there?
Oh, way beyond Dunlow. Way beyond. They went down they had to go for fishing. And when the fishing was heavy, they wouldn't come home. They would stay down and get digs in some of the houses until the fish disappeared, you know. So then it was back home again, and then the hay had to be cut with all scythes and hooks. The hay had to be cut. The corn had to be cut. The potatoes then had to be dug. You know, the turf had to be got down, and there was nothing but the horse. He was lucky. He had a horse and cart. Most people only had a couple of donkeys with baskets, creels. You know, so he had. It was a very busy. The people worked hard. They rested in the winter time, but at the same time they worked even in the winter time, because when the storms brought in the seaweed, the people were all down gathering the seaweed and taking the seaweed out to spread in the land.
So the fertilizer was.
There was no fertilizer.
There was no and seaweed.
The seaweed and the manure from the cattle was what was the only fertilizer. There was no artificial fertilizers at all. The sulfate ammonia and all these things came later.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they had to set big fields was because the crops, the ground was not good. The ground wasn't so fertile. The few round the coast was the best land, but the further up and on the island you went, the land became more peaty, you know, and it wasn't fertile land. The potatoes and things grown on it weren't as good as the land round the coast.
There was more of a carry on the seaweed and stuff as well, wasn't there?
Well, they worked hard at that. They did. Boys worked very hard. Boys coming from school would yoke the donkeys and come down to the beach and take the seaweed up, like the lake of them houses up the mountain, you know, where them new houses.
Mm-hmm.
The people living up there, they manured the land, from the beach there. That was hard going with the donkey.
Carry, yeah.
Long. The boys once they came from school, they put the baskets on the donkeys and they went away to the mountain, and they took down turf, 2 or 3 loads of turf, you know, and in the winter time they took up the seaweed. They had to take down the turf, you see, because there was no tractors. The turf, a donkey doesn't take much turf, you know. You'd burn it in a day, a load of turf. And these boys worked like Patwarawan over there, and them fellas, you know, they were working all the time, and it's a big change. And then people went away to Scotland, and seasonal work, and even boys left school and went over to Scotland in May and June, and came back in November after working a season in Scotland in the potato fields. Came back and went to school again. Mm-hmm. Here on the island.
So they come back for the harvest, would they?
No, they came back when the potato season was finished in Scotland.
In Scotland.
Aye, they came back in November. They came sure it was 1935 coming back in November that the disaster occurred. Mm-hmm. The 19 people were drowned.
That's right.
Aye, people came back in November because the potato crop had been all dug. That time they went over to Scotland in June. They went over in June, and the early lands in Scotland then was down Wigtonshire and Ayrshire coast. That's where the first earlies were dug. Mm-hmm. And they worked their way up into the colder parts of Scotland, up around Dumbarton, Fife and Perthshire, you know, later on in the year when the later crops. So they usually finished up around Perth and Fife and places like that by November, and they would come home then.
And the harvest here, would they have an early crop potatoes here and a late crop?
The island here is the earliest potatoes grown on the island here is over around Plahog, because it gets more sun and it is a sandy soil. The earliest potatoes would be dug there, but the people here generally went for the late potatoes, a late crop of potatoes. Some of the people coming from Scotland would dig their own potatoes after coming here, mm-hmm. would dig their own potatoes. And the ones that the money was needed, and a father would go away with maybe a couple of girls, some of his daughters and sons, you know, and the woman in the house left behind. She had the cows to milk. She had to look after the cows, and she had to. If there was a couple of younger ones at school, they would take down the turf with the donkeys, you see, mm-hmm. and she would dig her own potatoes later on if the father and the children were still in the Scottish fields, you know.
So it would have been hard for...
The money was all sent home.
It would have been hard for a woman with a young family with a husband away.
a woman with a young family just had to struggle. The man went away, and he would be away possibly from June until March, because he would stay over the winter on the farms and dress the potatoes. The potatoes were put in pit, you see, and the potatoes had to be dressed, the buds taken off them, and that was winter work.
So
He would winter out on farms, some of the fathers, to stay as long, to earn as much money as they could, and then he would come home in the springtime, March, April, in order to set the potatoes and cut the turf.
It's Kathleen now here.
Aye.
Right.
You're right. Well, immigration from the island to Scotland has been going on since about the beginning of the 19th century.
Right.
Because my grandfather went to Scotland once. He went to Scotland when he was about 20. That would be about 1867.
Right.
And the reason he only went once is because he said he made more at home on the herring fishing, than he did in Scotland. He went to Scotland with two of his brothers and another man, four of them, and they walked to Derry. And they got the boat from Derry and when they were in Derry, they bought sickles. Each of them bought a sickle or a hook.
How long would it take to walk to Derry? Yeah.
Oh, these fellas would walk over the hills. They'd probably walk over to around Fintown. He never told me, but they would stay overnight. They wouldn't walk to Derry with one go.
Oh, okay.
They'd walk 20 miles, at least 20 miles, you know, and they'd stay somewhere inland and make the rest of the way to Derry. But in Derry, they bought hooks. It's their hand sickles. For the farmers in Scotland didn't supply these. The Irish men took their own, and they got off at the Broomielaw in Glasgow, and they began walking, and they walked into the Lothians of Scotland.
Sorry, just you say they walked to Derry. They got the boat then from Derry.
From Derry, a kettle boat.
Right.
A kettle boat to Glasgow.
Correct.
And once they got into Glasgow, they began walking. They went into little tea places for grub. They began walking. And they walked into the Lothians. They were a couple of days walking until they got to a farm. It was the harvest time. It was August. And they began cutting oats. And the target was 1/4 of an acre a man, cutting the oats, tying them and stooking them. Right. Have you seen oats stooked?
I have seen them in the past.
Aye.
So that would be with a hook. That's
with the hook. It was ladder work. Each man worked with the hook, and he cut a certain amount, and the farmer paid them for that.
Right.
And the weather was very good. And they worked a full week.
So it was it wasn't a daily wage, it was piecework, more or less?
It was piecework. And they were getting more than the average hand on the farm, because the average Scots worker, he feed on for the season, or he might even stay several seasons on one farm, and he was paid a weekly wage. So these Irishmen were earning more than he was, but the farmer could pay them off at any time. But he couldn't do that with his own hands. He had to keep them on.
So the Scots had a bit of security?
He had security. He had his home as well. The Scots ploughman had no home of his own. His home was when he worked with the farmer. And if he left the farmer after a year or two, that the next house he went to, that was his home. And that's the only security he had, because they never earned enough money to make a home of their own. So my grandfather told me a funny story about being in Scotland. He said that on one farm they worked 7 days without a break. He said the weather was good. He said, and they cut 1/4 acre every day. And on the 8th day it started to rain. It was a downpour. And the Irishmen were in a bothy. A bothy is a little hut attached to every farm, where these sort of workers lived. So my grandfather was surprised to see the Scotsmen coming down the road in the pouring rain, and them all dressed with their bowler hats. So he went out. He was a man of the gab, my grandfather. He had a great gift of the gab, you know, a good English speaker, you know, and well read. And he said to one of the men, "Jock," he says, where are you going in this downpour?" "Oh, you can," he said to my grandfather, "there's a funeral today." "Who's dead?" My grandfather said, "The farmer's daughter's dead." "And when did she die?" "Oh, she died a week ago," he said. "But we had no time to bury her," he said, "with the good weather." So, of course, the Irishmen were amazed at this. You know, something like this wouldn't have happened at home. You see, it was a different culture, a different religion, a difference in speech. The Irish were looked on with a sort of with suspicion, you know, and sort of distrust. And there's no doubt at all in my mind there was a lot of animosity towards Irish workers over there, and towards the Irish coming in, you know. And it was around the middle of the 19th century, the Irish flocked into around Glasgow and Lanarkshire and Ayrshire, you know, and into factories and places like this, and there was a lot of ill will. And there was other Irish people. The Ulster people all made for Scotland, and the Ulster Protestant, he went to Scotland too, but he was liked better than the Ulster Catholic because of the religion, and he was of course descended from the Scots, the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians came into Ireland in the 17th century. And that was the plantation of Ulster. And the Presbyterians took the land of the Irish. The Irish, for any excuse at all, usually because they were said to be rebels that had fought against the Parliament. They were dispossessed of their lands. And these Scottish Presbyterians from the lowlands and the borders, they were given the land. And the Irish were given poorer land on the moors and the hillsides, and that animosity then grew between the two sections in Ulster, and that's the result of it that we see today. Mm-hmm. And these Irish Catholics from Donegal and Derry and Tyrone, they brought this. They were the same animosity arose in Lanarkshire and Ayrshire with the Ulster Protestants.
So there'd be rivalry.
Rivalry was there, but they were better liked by the Scots.
Would the Ulster Presbyterians, would they be working class as well? You know,
they were working class as well. They were working class as well. They went into the mills and factories. The Irish, they were working class, yes. But some of them would be semi-skilled, you know. But they would get on better than the Catholic Irish because of the religion, and because they were you could say they were Ulster Scots, you know. But I was very surprised as a boy when I went to Scotland first and found that. I was looked down upon because I was Irish, you know. I wasn't prepared for this. I thought I could go over there and just mix with the people and be one of them. Mm-hmm. But no, my speech gave me away, you see. And I found a lot of animosity. And when I left the taddy fields, when I left the squads and went to work solo, I went to farms to pull sugar beet and to pull turnips. And generally do piecework, where I was earning more money than the Scots worker, the farm worker, you know. Lots of these fellas could have been my father, you know, but I got a bit of stick from them all sometimes, you know.
The farm workers themselves.
The farm workers, not the farmer. No, the farmer. I found the farmers always very fair to me, you know. And I could go back time and time again to different farmers because they were agreeable. I was agreeable to them, you know. And plus, I worked hard. That was the Irishman did work hard because he was working. He was being paid for the amount of work he done, so he worked hard in order to earn more. But very often I found discrimination and bigotry among the people, you know. And very often I had to defend the Catholic Church, defend the priests, defend the nuns. The priests, a common thing over there, the farm workers, when they'd be talking to you, and what does the priest do for his wee bit, you know? And it was a common belief among a lot of them that the nuns were the concubines of the priests, you see. And then they would always get on to you about confession. Do you confess your sins to the priest and all this sort of stuff, you know? Mm-hmm. But after a while, as I got older and learned more, I was able to combat these people, you know. The first year or two, I was bewildered by the whole thing, but I gradually got to live with it and give as much as I took.
What age were you when you went away yourself?
14.
That's the first
14,
year.
aye. Yeah.
And would that be typical of Ireland?
Oh yes, and some of them went much earlier. I know that some of them worked a season in Scotland. When a season was from June to November or December, and they would come home and go to school again because they were under 14. But it was a necessity. The people were poor, and it was necessary to earn money, you know. I always thought that the English education wasn't sufficient on the island here. When I came to the island at 12, I was amazed at how poorly educated the boys were in English. The school books were very poor, very poor. They were childish to me. Because coming from Belfast and only being educated in English, you know, I was far ahead of them here. Of course, they were bilingual here, and they had two languages here. Well, I only had one, but the second language, the Gaelic language, in which they were proficient, wasn't much good to them when they went across to England or Scotland, as we went to, you know.
And would they have spoken Irish among themselves when they were in Scotland?
There would. Irish fellas meeting together in pubs would speak Irish. And although this side of the island, the Libgara side of the island, were prone to speak English, because with the hotel being here and the post office and a lot of visitors coming to the hotel, people spoke more English here than they did. Even today now over in Offord, the people speak Irish among themselves, you know. It's still remained that way over there.
That would be their first language.
But I remember when I was working in the pits in Scotland, one night coming home, I was working on back shift. That was 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 10 at night, and I came home one night, and as I came in the hallway to my digs, it was a big house, and there was a drunken Scotsman in the dining room. And he was condemning the part that De Valera played in the Second World War, and talking and condemning the Irish for not joining up. And there was a dozen Irishmen there, and from my own island, and not one of them contradicted, not one of them spoke, you know, because they couldn't, although they had lived through the period this man was talking about, you know. And that was just their lack of education, you know. So I came in anyway, and I told this fella off, you know, told him the truth about Ireland and about the war and about the part 40,000 Irishmen played in the Second World War and the VCs they had won. They had won as many VCs as Scotland, a country that was recruited. You know, that the Irish were, all Irishmen that fought in the Second World War, they were all volunteers. And this Scotsman, he couldn't answer me, you know. And he went up and went to bed. And as soon as he went to bed, I turned round and I gave a I gave a bollocking to the boys that were sitting around there listening to him, not one of them opening their mouth, you know. But that was just because of the lack of education, lack of a good English education.
They wouldn't have the confidence to speak.
They had no confidence, no, they had no confidence, no. And a lot of Irish people, the lack of education showed up in other ways. A lot of them, when they went over there and were made to feel secondary to the Scots, they adopted the Scottish way of talking to appear better than what they were. Many of them would go over for 6 months, and when they come back, they were speaking Scotch lingo, you know. It was laughable to me, you know, but it was sad. It was sad, you know, because they felt superior. They felt the Scots were superior. Later on in life, you know, after 2 or 3 years, I could see that the majority of the Scottish people that I was working with knew very little, you know, knew a lot less than I did myself, you know, and it was. I really felt for them at times, because I gave them a roast instead of them roasting me, you know. And really, and looking back now, I can understand why this animosity was there, because a lot of the Irish going over there at that time, they were away from home, and they were the only time they felt at ease when they were together, and when they were in drinking in pubs. And sometimes when they were in drinking in pubs, this pent up feeling they had towards the Scots, towards the way they were being treated, led to a lot of fighting, and the Irish got a rough name because of this. Got a name of being brawlers and drinkers, you know. And I don't feel any animosity towards the Scots today, because I can see that our own people today in this relatively well off Ireland, that we're showing animosity towards the people that's coming into our country. We're having a go at these Eastern Europeans that's coming in.
It's a bit of a double standard, isn't it?
Aye, yeah. It seems to me that all working class people are suspicious of other people, other people coming into their country. You know, the Scots could say that we were taking the jobs from them. But then, once the hydroelectric jobs started, once the war was over and the hydroelectric jobs started, Irishmen went to the hydroelectric jobs, because these jobs were away out in the mountains, where dams were being built to contain lakes, and tunnels being driven down to turbines. And this sort of work suited the Irishmen, because there's big hours, long hours, and good money. And it also attracted the Poles. A lot of Polish people stayed on in Scotland after the war. They didn't go home, because Poland was under communism, under Russia at that time. So a lot of Poles stayed in Scotland, and they married in Scotland. And their descendants are in Scotland now today with Polish names.
And how would they get on with the Irish?
The Poles and the Irish got on well. The Poles had the same nature as the Irish. They were there to make money, and they were good workers. They worked hard. And the Scots were in a minority in all these jobs. There were very few Scots, because it didn't really suit the Scots people. Scots people had homes of their own, and it didn't suit them being out in these huts, living in huts in the wilds, in the mountains, in the wilds of the mountains. Even though the money was good, the Scotsman preferred to stay at home and work in Glasgow and in the towns, you know. But the Irish and the Poles, they didn't have a home, and this suited them. A camp, living in a camp. These jobs went on for years.
What kind of buildings would be in the camp here?
The camps were just huts with about 30 wooden huts with about 30 beds in each hut, 15 beds aside, you know. And then there was a canteen. There was about up to 1,000 men in these on these jobs. Sometimes 2,000. Sometimes there would be 2 or 3 camps with a mile or two between them, and there was men at concrete work all the time, and there was joiners there. There was tradesmen of all kinds, steel fitters, and then there was the boys that were blasting the tunnels. The tunnels, the water you see was rising in the dam, and the water, when it came to a certain level, it would flow down these tunnels into the turbines. The turbines were way down at lake level. Mm-hmm. This is up. This is beautiful country we're working in. Beautiful country. This is my first hydro job when I was about 16, 17 was in Loch Lomond, off Loch Lomond, away to the west of Loch Lomond, a little place called Loch Sloy, and it was a wonderful country, beautiful country, you know. But most of us didn't see the beauty of the country. It was just work and sleep. It just work and sleep.
You're saying there that there would be tradesmen. Would many of the iron people have been?
No, there were no tradesmen. That was another big drawback. That there were no tradesmen as such. There was the Ironmore people. The Ironmore people all left school that time. It was a way of life. That immigration was a way of life. You knew you were going to immigrate. You knew you were going to leave home as soon as you left school, or shortly after you left school. You knew that. You knew this was your fate, because there was nothing to keep you here. There was no money here. Some people made a living here. Some people my grandfather made a living here because him and his brothers had a fishing boat, a yawl, and they had nets, and they were lucky. You could say they were lucky because they hit the fish. And my grandfather lived at home. He never left home except that one year when he went to Scotland. But the people in Ironmore knew it was a way of life. They knew they had to go home. They knew they had to immigrate because the money was needed at home. There was no employment at all. It was a way of life. You had to go.
What kind of proportion of the islanders would be in Scotland, say, over a season? Would there be hundreds? Hundreds, easily hundreds, because there was a big population in the island at the time. There were 1,400 people, so you can imagine a good proportion of those were young men from 14 up, and up to middle age. Up to middle age, men would be going up to middle age, and the girls would be away too. The girls would go away to the Taddyhogan. They were in the fields down in Wigtonshire and Ayrshire. And then later on, a lot of the girls would go into service. They'd go in as maids. And a lot of the girls in my time became nurses, because at that time they could train in the hospital to be a nurse. You didn't have to go to college or anything like that. Complete change now. Some of the girls, as I told you before, went on the buses, bus conductors. Some of them even drove tram cars in Glasgow while the rails were there, while there were trams there. Well, Hannah Howard's sister, Sheila Howard, drove a tram. But there were no tradesmen. There were handymen always on the island, fellas that could put a few sticks together and make a bit of furniture and stuff like that. But there was no tradesmen. They had no cards. Wouldn't be recognised?
No, never recognised. I mean, I done shutter work myself. Because I had a good idea of work, and I bought a hammer and a saw, and I got paid as a shutter man. But I wasn't recognised as a carpenter or anything like that.
They would get paid more?
They would. They had their cards.
And what kind of money would you be talking about at the time?
I'd be getting, I was earning 17, 18 pound a week at a time when maybe in a farm you'd be getting £5 or £6 a week, you know? Mm-hmm. Aye. But you were working big hours, you were working 12 hours. And as you got paid if you were working on the dam and you're working as a shutter man, You got paid more as the dam was rising up, because you were putting in the shutters for each section of the dam. This dam was rising until it finished. It was finally about 200 foot high.
Was that what?
And you were getting danger money, aye, danger money, aye. But there were no tradesmen, no tradesmen. In fact, there were the only people that there were a few people on the island who had a bit of money, like Jack Boyle, who had bought the hotel. He was able to educate his son Philly. Philly was in St Eunan's in Letterkenny, and some Barney Begg, a schoolmaster, his parents somehow got the money to send him to school, became a schoolmaster, you know. And Kitty Neely and her two sons worked hard in the potato fields in order to put the other son, the third son, through college. He became a doctor. That's Dr. Boyle, you know him, don't you?
Neil, is it?
Neil, aye. Well, you know Patrick over there.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, his brother.
Patrick Kitty Neely.
Aye, and Danny Kitty Neely. I don't know if you know Danny.
He's in Scotland?
He's in Scotland. He comes here with his wife sometimes. Yeah. They have the house on top of the hill there.
So Jack and the Glen, he would have worked in Scotland?
No, Jack made his money in America.
In America?
He made his money in America. But Kitty Neely and her two sons went to the Taddyhoken in order to get to earn the money to put the doctor through college. Mm. That was the sacrifice they made, you know. They made. But everyone was poor. The people were poor. There was, and it was a great island. It was a great island. When I came to the island, there were everyone was the same. There was no one rich, and the people were very. They done a lot for each other. Now, when I came to the island, a woman living on her own. The people would gather together and they would in one day they would put down their crops, and they would cut their turf, and do things like that.
Was there a name for that?
Yes, it was called a gathering.
A gathering.
A woman living on her own, or a woman with a sickly husband, or some person that had little help, old people that got old. They would have a gathering on a certain day. All the men in the village, and maybe other villages. Say it was someone in Libgera. Well, you'd get people coming from Pulwadi and Scraig over as well, you know.
Oh, right.
Aye.
So there'd be how many in a
Oh, there could be. It was an afternoon affair after dinner. Men would gather about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This was say April, May, you know, and they wouldn't come at any special time. Some fella would be there at 1 o'clock. Stragglers would come maybe round 2 o'clock, you know, but they would finish the field. They would set all their potatoes in one day, you know. And there's other people then. There was a little green woman up the mountain. I always give her a day's cutting every year, cut her turf every year, you know. And there was two women up on top of the mountain, Gracie and Biddy. Two women cut their turf too. Cut turf for them, you know.
So people looked after one another?
Well, there was always charitable people that would do this, but they looked after. They did look after people, you know. And before the television came to the island, before traffic came to the island, before there was any traffic on the island, Joe Boyle had a shoe shop over there, and when the springtime came, he usually wanted a pair of boots, because you worked so hard here in the fields that you needed a pair of boots every year. There were those tackety boots, you know, with the nails on them that last longer, you know. And you'd go over to Joe Boyle's for a pair of boots for the springtime. And every field, there were people in every field setting crops, setting potatoes, or delving out land for corn or something. And they'd shout to you when you're passing any news from Libgera, something like that. And you'd be talking to people. You could go away in the morning and not come back till the afternoon.